Good morning, hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Developing the Trust, a podcast series dedicated to those working in and across the niche academy sector. This morning, I'm delighted to be joined by Ian Denison of Inscyte, a company he is a co-founder of, and where, amongst other services, he provides client-side support to readdress the balance of PFI contracts. Ian was recently heard on the BBC4 radio programme, The Great PFI Debate, and also widely quoted in a recent Schools Week piece on PFI. Good morning, Ian, and thank you so much for agreeing to be a guest. I'm very grateful for you agreeing to take part today. And it's my job over the next 30 minutes or so to tease out of you the issues that I feel will be of interest to those many stakeholders who may well listen to this podcast. Ian, if I could start, what first brought you, how come did you originally involved with PFI?
This is normally an after dinner speech that I make around my journey into PFI, but I'll try and cut that short. In essence, I was the design and technical lead for a major post-PFI project. I worked within that organisation for 5 years, during which time the PFI process is one whereby a design brief is put out to the marketplace bids for it. You then go from the wide bidding market down to a preferred for, down to a preferred to a preferred bidder, who is then appointed as effectively the contractor to take forward to deliver the scheme. That's all done on the basis of a budget profile. And in essence, we reached the preferred bidder stage. And then at that point, the wheels began to get a little bit loose on the cart. And we took a 4-year process. And in doing so, we went from a project that was originally kind of targeted at 600 million to a project that was being put on the table as a £1 billion project. And at that point, quite rightly, everybody involved, the NHS Trust, the Secretary of State, were looking at this going, this isn't financially viable. When the actual project was canned, in essence, what happened then was a kind of retribution and blame scenario happened. And the private sector organisation involved were keen to recover quite substantial costs. And I was keen to stop that on the basis that the reason the scheme didn't go ahead was there was just this almost greed growth plan that they had. We had a public sector comparator, which is what the public sector need to develop for a 600 million scheme that was part refurb, part new build. They wanted to get rid of all of the refurbishment and make it totally new build. And that's where the cost just started to escalate out of hand. So that happened in November 2006. And I saw that through, supported the trust in the legal claims that were then laid against the trust around the compensation for the private sector. A deal was done on the steps as usual. And at that point, I decided somebody needs to do something to support the public sector, because we are largely rabbits in the headlights here. We're up against the big boys, and we're just trying to run services for public good cause. You know, that was an NHS trust. Schools are in the same boat. So I decided somebody needed to do something, and it just so happened that the time felt right for me. So in November 2007, I set up an organisation called Community Partnership Project Limited, and that's where the journey started. We changed our name in 2021, so the business has been going since 2007, and we became Inscyte in 21.
Excellent.
That's how I got involved.
What was the original context behind PFI? What was its genesis? Whose brainchild was it, and why was there a gap in the market for it to be developed?
The concept of private investment in public infrastructure is not new by any stretch of the imagination. You're going to look at both world wars, for instance. There was significant public and private partnership investment across the UK. So it's not a brand new model, and in actual fact, America's model is predominantly a PPP model. So the concept of this kind of partnership was not new. the significant difference was that the government at the time, which was coloured blue at the time, probably late 80s, definitely by 1992, had a concept that there was a huge gap in our infrastructure within the UK. A lot of buildings that were built in the 70s that should have been down for replacement. We'd stretched the life expectancy of an awful lot of public estate, and therefore something major needed to happen. And schools and hospitals were a key part of that thought process. And it was seen as getting the private sector to fund public infrastructure. And the idea was the transfer of risk. Now, although this was a brainchild from probably within the Conservative Party, the reality is the Labour Party adopted it in full glory, and the Blair-Brown partnership took PFI on. The difference was that I suppose the Labour Party were keen to ensure that the risk transfer was real. That's where the problem starts, because the definition of risk transfer never really happened. Ultimately, the estate is still owned by the public sector, operated under license by the private sector, and developed by the private sector as a D&B, a design and build process, with fairly limited checks and balances during that process. As much as there's an argument to say there was lots of parties involved, the actual parties involved were not experts in construction. They were public sector parties that were looking to develop hospitals and schools for the benefit and purpose of education and health, not for the purpose of getting the best building off the ground.
And that's the bit that I think that you touched on there, is how we define the risk, how we define the rewards, how equitable they were. And so what I'm interested is in terms of the development of PFI, it almost feels like it was a very top-down relationship, in terms of it was designed from above, as it were. And was there any proper consultation in terms of users and stakeholders?
When you look back, there's an awful lot of rhetoric about user engagement, and those were languages that we use when you're getting schemes to preferred bidder, that the users will be involved in the design process. But ultimately, the contract, which is the actual mechanism that underpins PFI, was definitely a top-down approach, and massively influenced by the private sector. Because the key thing was actually trying to court the private sector to get them to buy into the concept of funding projects and, in theory, taking risk. So ultimately, if you go and ask somebody who doesn't like risk to design something that's going to minimize their exposure to risk, then they're going to have a different view to you, who is just saying, we want you to take the risk. So ultimately, teams of lawyers, teams of private sector experts, and some degree, some public sector, but probably at kind of government level, got together and decided to shape the way in which these contracts were developed. And ultimately, it was, how do we get the private sector to invest in the UK whilst we're not putting anything on the accounts? So it didn't matter what government was. What they didn't want was to actually have a huge investment laid against the bottom line of the accounts in the UK. So the private sector fund the project, and we ended up with a mortgage payment. So it almost ended up in a scenario where you were passing the problem down the line, which is what we've got now, is that the problem is definitely down the line, because the energy and the enthusiasm was getting the private sector to fund these projects, not actually what does that mean for the next 25 years.
So at the front end, we realized as a country that we wanted it off balance. We thought that on balance that the private sector would be better to maintain that risk, but we asked the wolf in to that camp, and obviously they will have calculated, and it built the risk in, which, as you've just said, has been slowly kicked down the line. And also, the thing that I always find intriguing is that very often, especially from the public sector, they simply don't have the army of resources that can pick apart a contract, which is effectively being designed by the contractor, by the other side. And so, for me, what was it flawed from day one? Was it ever going to be equitable?
I think there's almost there's four sides to this, in the sense that you have a very top high level interpretation of a contract that's been written, and they then define the design that's going to underpin the project, and then groups of technical people then design that from an architectural perspective, an engineering perspective, and then that is a piece of paper. You then take that to a subcontractor who's a builder, and you say to him, build us this, and you've got to build it for X pounds. So the first thing that happens is the builder goes, I don't really want to build it for X pounds, or if I am going to do that, I don't want to build it to that standard, and I can probably cut these corners here and there, and actually before we know it, we've got a building that isn't quite what it was on the plan, but actually is being built. And this is where the technical expertise weakness comes in, is that you're asking people who deliver healthcare, deliver prison services, deliver highways, infrastructure systems, deliver schools, to actually technically analyze whether the engineering part of that building has been changed in order for the design that was gold star to now be bronze or below. And
But
in
was
essence,
that a
that's
flaw?
what happened.
Was that a flaw in part of the process, that there wasn't sufficient client side, there wasn't a sufficiently robust eyes on that process? Is that the first? Would you say that was the first area that it fell down on?
I think the first failures before then is that nobody realized that that's what would happen. Everybody kind of slightly went into this thinking that we've got the best people in the world effectively to design our buildings and deliver them. Therefore, what are we worrying about? Now, that concept I can understand, and it isn't about the private sector bad, the public sector good. It's actually about having the right mechanism in place. What we didn't have was a series of logical understandings as to what would naturally happen in the process, and where would the checks and balances need to be in order to prevent just a natural course of events diminishing the quality of the output.
So obviously, if we just take a very basic roofing contract, for example, there would be a scope of works and specification. The partner would deliver that, but there would be checks and balances from, for example, the system manufacturers. Their field technicians would have check and hold milestones before they were allowed to continue, to make sure that the quality was there. Was that missing?
Well, in theory, no, it wasn't. In theory, the concept is that, if you have a roofing mechanism, a process that you're going to engage, and you have a manufacturer that's providing the product, in reality, the product should have been signed off by the manufacturer. The problem with it is that it depends on when they did those checks, and it depends on how much involvement they had during the construction phase in order to understand what was happening. You give somebody an end product, a building that's built, you can't see what's gone inside, what's happened actually to make that facade present itself. And a lot of the problems that we find is that actually it's the intrusive element of the construction process that has actually been tampered with effectively. And I don't say tampered in the sense of criminal activity. It's almost a natural osmosis that people are going to look to deliver things at the most cost-effective way they can. You ask the private sector to build something for X, they've got a profit margin that they're looking to secure, and they will do whatever it takes to ensure the profit margin is still there at the end of that process.
Well, I 100% understand that's normally the rules of engagement. However, in some respects, the system manufacturer is going to hold a warranty to that. So again, one would hope that was an additional check and balance in terms of the quality of the installation, etc. And if we find ourselves at the end of a project where that hasn't happened, which is potentially where we are now, there's bound to be some finger pointing in terms of where those checks and balances, where those processes were, and who is responsible for that.
You then get into the realms of who's responsible. So you're quite right to point that out, and that's where the game starts to happen, because the SPV ultimately is the contracted party, so they're accountable for the outcome of the construction period. However, they've got a 12-year liability sat with the construction company, who also is then saying, well, hang on a minute, how was this roof maintained? Is it to do with my design failure, or is it to do with maintenance? So you've got an FM provider still under the SPV's responsibility, who's going, no, I've maintained it perfectly, it's nothing to do with me. So before you know it, you have a three-way argument outside of the public sector about who's responsible. Meanwhile, the rain's still pouring in the roof's not fixed and nobody's dealing with the problem, rather than actually turning around and saying, we don't care, Mr. SPV, we're not interested in you sorting out your problem over there, you're going to have to fix it. And that's one of the major failings within PFI, is the level of power that the contract holds doesn't allow the immediacy of a resolution to a known problem. It's always a commercial negotiation. And once you get into commercially negotiating whether the roof is leaking or not, or who's responsible for that leak, that's when the public sector end up with the problem, because the leak goes on until those commercial negotiations have concluded.
Can you just help listeners and viewers again in terms of explaining from the various parties, from the original investors, the subcontractors, the FM providers, the local authorities, and then ultimately, certainly in my sector, the users being the schools, in terms of the hierarchy of power, and who holds the whip hand? Because very often, as a client, we should hold the whip hand. We should ultimately be saying, well, I'm going to withhold money until X, Y, and Z is sorted, and that there seems to be a disconnect in that.
I think that disconnect depends on the relationship with the public sector party. So some authorities, some councils are very good at holding their SPV PFI contractor to account and will withhold, and they use that as a means of actually getting improvement on the ground. Others won't, and they see that as the SPV are a powerful partner to the authority, and that they are almost part of the process with them, and therefore don't hold them to account to the contract, but try and somehow have a friend's discussion about how we'll resolve the problem. And actually, that can never work, because ultimately it's a contract. It's a contract with a payment mechanism, which I'll explain in a bit. And the payment mechanism is the means by which you measure the performance of the contractor against what you're paying for. And that gets lost a lot in the transition and the translation of the responsible parties. But to kind of answer your question, ultimately, the power shifts in PFI. It starts off with the banks, the finance houses, investing X amount of money into getting a project up and running. And then as a result of that, an SPV, a special purpose vehicle, is formed, which is a limited company, who will manage the actual contractual process and manage the contract. But they are effectively a limited company deliberately set up with a single purpose. So they don't have billions of pounds behind them. The finance houses are not putting their own money on the table or their obligations on the table in any great way. And then you have an FM contractor and a construction partner. The construction partner tends to be a big player and therefore is a multinational business with lots of noughts after their bottom line. And then an FM provider who is quite often the same, that we are looking at the biggest partners in the industries. So effectively, the contract has been, once the finances have been put in and the building's been built, the main contractor then takes a back seat. They've got their 12-year warranty on the aspects of the building, but they take a back seat in the ongoing management of the contract. And then the FM provider becomes a very major part of the contractual relationship. Bearing in mind that the FM provider will be a multinational company normally, and will be multi times bigger than the SPV that's set up to manage the contract. So in essence, that's where some of the problems start to happen, is that the tail is definitely wagging the dog quite often. You add to that the relationship with the public sector, whether they see this as a contract or a partnership. Now, the governments, whichever government you look at, we're selling PFI as it we're in partnership with the private sector. We're all in it together. We all want one goal. The reality is that's not true. It could never be true and should never have been entered into that kind of relationship. The reality also is that in order to emphasize that, the government thought it would be a good idea to actually make the public sector parties an investment partner in the actual projects. So they're also quite often seen as a small shareholding element of the PFI. Now that causes a problem, because if I'm a academy trust school and I'm suddenly aware that actually my council that are not acting the way I want them to act is actually gets shared dividends from the actual PFI project that I'm asking them to manage on my behalf. How does that work? So how can it work? Now, in reality, that share arrangement is so small, it's insignificant, but it's part of the language. So that's what
and a conflict of interest. Exactly.
Yeah, there's a level of conflict of interest. Invariably, it doesn't materialize itself because the authorities that work well with PFI actually have forgotten that they're a shareholder and they just deal with the contract. Where it goes wrong is the authorities that actually believe that they are a shareholder and that they want that relationship. And the main reason why that was set up in the first place was the concept of PFI was that it was going to go on and that we were going to have a whole public sector investment profile for infinite years, partnered with private sector partners working with public sector entities. When the PFI contract model was canned in 2013, then in essence, that relationship ended at that point because all we had was the projects that were built, not the projects that might be built. So that creates the dynamic straight away.
Exactly. So looking where we are now with a number of certain, I mean, obviously I'm only involved in schools rather than the health sector. There obviously is something like, it's quite a large number of hundreds of schools, which in the next decade or so, the PFI contract will be coming to an end. And you, amongst others, have acted as the canary, and alerted stakeholders to the risks that if they do not commence battle, then they are going to be on the back foot. So a couple of things I want to tease out of you there. One is, how best do they prepare? How early do they need to prepare? And B, what are the risks and to whom if that does not happen?
So, I mean, the thing to say is that obviously we're a small business in essence. We're a project management consultancy. So I'm bound to say, oh, the earlier the better, and bring us in and we'll deal with it all for you. The reality is that the IPA, the DfE's own partner in PFI expiry, have published a number of kind of documents and guidance notes, which in their own publications are saying 7 to 8 years. You need to start 7 to 8 years before expiry in order to have a chance of getting this through. And I always describe this in education in particular as how you've got to think of this is that how many summers have I got left before expiry? I can only do any material works on my school sites in that summer holiday. If I've got 6 weeks, there's a week of mobilization, and then there's a week of actual close out in order ready for the school to open in September the 5th. The reality is that means I've only got 4 weeks worth of actual work I can do. If I need to replace boiler systems, roofs, if I need to replace ventilations, electrical infrastructure systems, catering equipment, major equipment, access control systems, fire doors, I can't do that in a couple of summers. I need a whole block of summers to ensure that happens. In addition to that, we know from our experience the level of detail that is held at school level on statutory compliance, on PPMs, is at best woolly, and at worst it's actually non-existent. And so consequently, if I'm going to take back a building and I'm going to become responsible for it, I need to ensure that I've got everything that relates to the functionality of that estate as quickly as I can. And therefore, we recommend it's at least 7 years out. The other reason why we say this is that, going back to my earlier point about PFI ends up being a commercial negotiation, you're going to end up negotiating about the condition of the estate, who was responsible for what life cycle needs to be invested where, how much has been invested previously, where all that life cycle money sits, what happens at the end of the contract. Does the private sector get a big swag bag full of money and wander off into the distance with his non-spent life cycle? All of those things need teasing out, need exposing, and then need negotiating and managing. And then it needs monitoring to make sure the works are done in line with what your expectation is.
So Ian, how do we get visibility on, if you like, the funds which have been set aside to ensure that that asset is returned in the condition that was originally set out in a contract? Where do those numbers sit?
They sit in the financial model, which underpins the. So one of the things about financial model which always gets me within PFI is that the unitary charge is based on a financial understanding, and that's paid every month. And if we take an academy trust, for instance, with a PFI school, the EFSA are told how much that PFI costs, and that's factored into their to their funding for that academy. Their per pupil price goes up based on the PFI cost. There are discrepancies in that, and actually a lot of trusts come to us saying we just do not get anything like the unitary charge payments we're having to pay from our AFSA. Why don't we? And there's always quite a number of reasons for that. But in essence, that's what sets up what the financial model looks like. Therefore, if there is a financial model, it's available to the authority. They know about it. They know it per school. So if an authority's got 15 schools in a PFI contract, they can work out exactly what each school's costs are for that PFI. They know also from that financial model how much money was included to be spent on life cycle over the life of the project. And that's the crucial thing. So over the life of the project, we know as construction industry people, we know that life cycle is not a linear. It actually moves up and down based on the life expectancy of a component of a building. So we know that come year 16 to year 19, there's got to be investment in the estate because some of the infrastructure is going to need replacing. The other thing in PFI, classically, what we've seen is if we take biomass boilers, for instance, as a classic example, they were heralded as the panacea for all public sector investment projects. And I know of lots and lots of PFI schools that have got biomass boilers, but I know of hardly any that are operational. So they're relying on the fallback, which is their gas heating. And that means that basically those generators that were meant to be the backup to the biomass have actually been running 100% since the start of the contract. So consequently, they need replacing. Now, you've got to manage the PFI contractor to make that happen. Because if I'm the PFI, if I'm the FM provider, and I know that any money I don't spend on life cycle, I'm going to keep, then it's in my interest not to actually make those massive infrastructure changes.
And there again, surely there is the thorny question of replace, repair, renew, etc., and how nebulous that can be. You know, if you can patch something up and pass it off as good as new, you haven't had to replace it, have you? And yet that liability and risk is going to perpetrate beyond the end of the contract, isn't it?
Yeah, and then if you take, one of the key things about the financial model is that under PFI, for an academy trust in particular, not so much a community school, but for an academy trust in particular, they should or are entitled 95% of the time to request the financial model, to actually have sight of it. I don't know of any academy trust that has got that access, and it tends to be seen as a scary thing to do for both the public sector and the SPV to provide that financial model. Yet that's the basis of the mortgage payments. That's what the unitary charge is based on. So why not provide it?
Is that the prerogative of the trust, or does it have to come through, for example, the LA?
Well, the trust won't naturally have the financial model because the financial model will sit with the local authority and the SPV, because that financial model was what basically created the mortgage payment, the unitary charge, the monthly costs. That's what created those monthly costs. That's what was signed up to. So once that financial model exists, in reality, that determines how the PFI is funded and paid for and what the expectation is in terms of FM service costs and in terms of life cycle and PPM. And there'll also have been a risk factor in the financial model on behalf of the PFI contractor, because the payment mechanism, which I mentioned earlier, is the key performance indicating measurement tool that actually links to PFI. Now, the reason why there's a payment mechanism in PFI is because you're giving somebody a 25-year contract. Therefore, you need a mechanism by which you can police it and actually incentivize the private sector to improve the service. Now, the incentivization is deductions. So the financial deductions actually are built into PFI to protect the public sector and to incentivize the private sector to maintain a high level of service. However, the bottom line is if I am a clever PFI contractor and a clever FM contractor, I'm going to do everything I can to ensure I don't get any deductions, because actually it's hidden profit, because I've already got a risk line in there. So that's one area where you see that comes back to life cycle, because why do I want to replace it if I can repair it, not replace it, and therefore get that money at the end, but also not replace it, repair it, and not get any deductions for it is another profit line. So we've almost created an environment that encourages a non-open book approach to the management of assets. Now, people who support PFI will say that's rubbish, but the reality is that nobody anywhere can share with me where they have handed over the financial model to an academy trust and said, that's what you're paying for. So if you want to look at what it costs for cleaning, that's what it's costing you for cleaning. If you want to look at what it costs you for maintenance, that's what it's costing you for maintenance. It's all based on this model, indexed up year on year. If you've made changes yourself with variations, there'll be additional costs, but generally that financial model is the Bible.
Fine. We've only got a couple of minutes left. What I want to do is basically channel any viewers, listeners that feels that they are going to benefit from your services to come and contact you. Clearly, you are in a experienced position of fighting to access such cost plans, such life cycle costs, etc., to be able to push back. But obviously, given the 7 years, etc., that's going to be required, and it's obviously not just going to be, issues around estates. It's going to be a whole raft of other things, which I imagine will require a multidisciplinary approach. I want to encourage people to be able to come and contact you. Could you just give an email address or a telephone number so that anyone watching, viewing this that feels that you could be of assistance can contact you?
Yeah, no problem. I mean, in terms of my email address, he says, thinking I don't know what my email address is, but
the company
Ian.Denison at Inscyte.co.uk. I don't mind people contacting me direct, so my mobile number is 07866671011. I don't mind if the PFI world wants to contact me and have a rant at me as well. That'd be great, because I'd like to have that conversation with them. So that's not a problem either. But yeah, and the website, if you go onto our website, we've got we've got an administration email, so people can actually get in touch with us straight away. We've got the team who pick those up on a daily basis and respond accordingly.